Morning, everyone. Morning. Right, well, I'm going to explain how we're going to deliver zero carbon dwellings, which follows on nicely from what Ellen was just talking about. Now, both of my presentations, this one and the second one, are to do with the consultations which were just closed a couple of weeks ago. So obviously this has gone into consultation, so please don't shoot me when it actually comes out and it's changed slightly. But anyway, let's see what they're promising, or what was in the core elements within the consultation documents, how we're going to deliver zero carbon. So a quick recap of what we're actually trying to do. As Ellen was talking about before, we're on this roadmap to zero carbon. So back in 2006, the Labour government defined this zero carbon requirement, what Paul also indicated as well. And it's in statute with the EU as well. So it's not just a British desire, a UK desire, it's a European desire. So we developed this roadmap, defined the timing, 2016, which is only 3 years away, or less than that now. And obviously, at the same time, had to look at a tool which was going to define what this measure was, and they said it's going to be part L, and within that SAP, the calculation tool. The government then in 2010, the current government, reiterated that this is what we're going to do. They seem to have forgotten about it for 3 years, and they mentioned it again this year. So there was a bit of a gap, and there wasn't a lot of work done on it. And there's an organisation called Zero Carbon Hub, which had been employed by the government to bring out all this information together and actually work out a methodology. So what I'm talking about today, this element here, is all kind of the work that the Zero Carbon Hub have put together over the last few years. So it's quite important, and both of this was in the budget. So apparently when they say it in the budget, they have to actually try and deliver it. We shall see. So going back to 2006, we started talking about carbon numbers. We used to talk about other things related to SAP compliance before, but we started talking about CO2 emissions. So everything we were talking about to get to zero carbon obviously has to be calculated in that method. As Ellen said, we have these uplifts. So next year should have been 44% improvement. So unfortunately it's been less than that. So that's going to make it harder for us to get to 2016, isn't it? Because we're not working towards a higher goal now, in theory. So 2016 zero carbon. So obviously, what's also really crucial, as somebody mentioned earlier on, is what are we talking about with zero carbon? What's the actual definition? So originally, we were talking about regulated and unregulated emissions. It's quite crucial, and something which we've been used to within the Code for Stable Homes. So regulated emissions are what are getting included within the SAP. So it's fundamentally the space and water heating. So in most cases when you've got gas, you're consuming gas, that's carbon numbers from gas, and fixed lighting. There's a little bit in there from pumps and fans as well. So the fixed lighting is obviously electrical consumption, and in most cases ideally we're talking about space and water heating from gas consumption. So that's the elements which gets bundled into SAP and generates a sort of carbon number. But then, as I've already said, we also want to include unregulated. So the unregulated is stuff outside of building regulations, outside of any control whatsoever in effect. So it's cooking and plug-in appliances. So it's all those plug-in appliances your kids have got, etc. Lights, plug-in lights, computers, and cooking. Now generally that's electricity. Electricity in this country is appalling in terms of carbon numbers. It's over twice as bad as gas consumption in terms of what carbon is generating per kilowatt hour. So there's quite a big problem there. So when we start looking at the numbers, us as code assessors and SAP assessors, we realise that the unregulated is contributing 40 to 50% of the total emissions of the dwelling. So it's a big issue because it's electricity, etc. So the methodologies which have been defined comes out of those sorts of numbers. But luckily we were saved, because in March 2011, when they realised there was this problem, they removed the unregulated emissions from the calculation. So 50% of the problem's gone already. So it's all going to be straightforward. So this is why the actual definitions of what we're talking about are obviously really crucial. And if you start actually thinking about it on a European scale, the definition in Spain for zero carbon is going to be completely different to ours, because they've got different heat. We've got cooling issues and stuff like that, which we haven't got. So it is all down to the definitions of what we're working to. So that's why this consultation is really important. So basically, this is what we're going to work towards. Zero carbon. And this consultation is introduced a new element called allowable solutions. So you're all very excited, I'm sure, about what this is. And this is what's been looked at over the last 3 or 4 years from the Zero Carbon Hub. So why do we need allowable solutions? For all the work we've done ourselves in the industry, the SAP industry, it's become quite clear that to get to zero carbon, to remove all those emissions from a dwelling, even just the regulated emissions, can't be achieved on site. Okay? You can't fit enough PV on most roofs to deliver you zero carbon. So the government actually finally understood this, so invented this new tool. So this is the statement which they announced. Where a house builder can deliver ambitious carbon saving targets on site, they'll have the option to do so. And where this is not cost effective, the government will ensure that there is a cost effective mechanism to deliver carbon saving targets off site at a cost no higher than the government's long term carbon value. That's just a straightforward question. That's easy, isn't it? So that's what we need to do. So basically, how are they proposing this would work? Some guys in the room may have been familiar with trying to build some schemes in Ashford, and they do something similar to this already. The planners in Ashford will expect a carbon fee for anything that can't be mitigated on site. So how will the allowable solutions work? So first of all, the developer will be expected to purchase carbon savings, okay, that's related to that development. So the first stage is what Ellen was talking about. You do your fabric strategy. Okay. Now there will be a target for this, whether that increases or not over what the building regulations say at the moment, going through from next year. There will be an FEE, a TIFI, and all these targets we'll have to achieve. Then there will be an on-site carbon compliance. So you will be expected to reach a target. All of these targets to be defined. That's what the consultation is looking at the moment. So we will be expecting a TER/DER target to be hit. And then whatever's left, you then go to this new marketplace, this new market framework, to deliver you your rest of your carbon savings. So in theory, we don't know where these particular bands are going to lie. So this will be across the board. This will be a building regulation thing. It won't be to do with if you're only building one house, you don't have to worry about this. It's across the board, is the proposal. So how will it work? So first of all, you need to employ somebody to do your SAP calculation to work out what your remaining carbon dioxide emissions are, what you need to purchase, what that off-site element will be. Then as a developer, you then need to identify a supplier and enter into a contract. So you've got so many tonnes of carbon, you need to buy a product, a carbon saving off-site. So you enter into that contract. You then make the payment to that supplier, your allowable solution supplier. You then receive a certificate for that. And then that would then go with your building regulations, compliance SAP documents, and your allowable solution. So they would balance up, add them together, and you've got zero carbon from that particular dwelling. Does that make sense? It's exciting, isn't it? So what are the actual allowable solutions? Now, a big part of the consultation is dealing with this because they originally were looking at just a fee to the local authority, whichever borough you're in. And obviously this coalition government weren't particularly happy creating a monopoly in that format. So they've started sort of going through different ideas of possible allowable solutions. So on site you could look at smart appliances, not quite sure what that means, but it's something to do with smart metering, etc. You could look at electric charging points for vehicles. You could look at PV storage, LED lighting, etc. So locally to where you're going to build out. Near site, they've put forward ideas of exporting low energy carbon heat. So if you've got a district heat network and you're building that up for your particular scheme, flats, etc., you could deliver low carbon heat to your neighbours. invest in a local heat network. So if there's a proposal for a local heat network, you could invest in that, etc. Or you could start doing some refits to local buildings. So if you're a particularly big contractor and you've got a refurb division, you could cross-subsidise it in effect. Or then there's the off-site ones, where you're actually looking in massive investments on wind farms, low carbon energy, electrical generation from waste plants, etc. So it's a big, broad portfolio of options they're looking at the moment. And again, they were looking for a response in the consultation.
So this is just a contribution to these programs, but these programs are not going to feed directly onto your building site?
No. So basically you're saying, yeah,
they're a donation.
You're a donation to a carbon saving process. So then obviously there's quantifiable measures how that's delivering. So the possible delivery mechanisms. So the simplest one is you don't do allowable solutions. You're able to fit enough PV on your roof and you deliver it in compliance. You're only doing the SAP. So that's the most straightforward one. And that is possible. We do that now. We've got some schemes, code level 5, 6, etc., where we've delivered that. So that would be the first and most straightforward option, I would suggest. Alternatively, the DIY, as they're calling it, is where you look at refits, local infrastructure programs, heat networks installed, delivering to the neighbours, and also an interesting one they sneaked in, which is they're calling Part L banking. And this is where you've got old schemes under older building regulations, the current ones, where you over-deliver on those ones, and you can use that over-delivery of carbon to support the new schemes. So obviously that's only got a timeline on it, because you've run out of the old schemes in theory. The next one is you go out to a third party, where there's some sort of brokering system, matching. This is a market they've got to create by 2016. So all of these sort of mechanisms have got to be sorted out. Or you could go direct to a wind farm supplier, who would obviously be very pleased to take some money off you, to deliver it. And finally, the fourth one is where you start looking at investments in funds, so like the Green Bank. So then they're contracted to actually use there for green policies, etc. It all sounds rather complicated. So obviously, we've gotten to 2016 to create a market, an economy, an allowable solution economy from nowhere, from a standing start. So we've only really got 3 years to do it, less than that. So what the government is proposing to do is within the consultation, was to look at setting a ceiling price for how much per tonne the carbon will be. And these were the 3 examples they put in to the consultation, because they felt that there needed to be a mechanism to get it started, and to generate this interest in this environment. So the first one was the low cost. The problem with this was obviously this is going to cause a massive problem for the suppliers of PV, solar hot water at the moment. So in effect it would be relatively cheap, and all the developers would do was just load on a massive amount of allowable solution, just pay a bigger bill, and offset it that way. So would restrict the development of the PV industry, etc. The middle one, there's lots of stuff I don't quite understand in terms of the carbon pricing indexes and how the electricity industry charge each other over carbon numbers at the moment. So there's lots of policy within the government which they think they understand related to costings of carbon, and this is sort of fitted in with that general strategy of the £60 per tonne. And to be honest, this is one that they look like they're going to push towards at the moment, that £60 per tonne of carbon. And then obviously the higher one was based on the PV costs. But what they were concerned about if they go too high is obviously the house builders will stop building houses. You know, and obviously that would be against their overall agenda to sort out the economy at the moment. So what does that actually mean for costs per dwelling? These are all zero carbon hub numbers, so that's basically what the sort of the fee structure they're looking at. So they're looking at around about 1,500 quid per dwelling. would be the allowable solution cost. So there's obviously quite a few issues related to creating this marketplace as quickly as possible. So I've only highlighted a few here, which are in the consultation, which is some of the discussion points in there. So there's obviously the first one is, when do you actually pay? Do you pay at the design stage? Or do you pay at completion? If you're paying at completion, then you've got a lot of our clients are coming up to CLM that the time is really crucial to getting your EPC out, to getting the house sold, etc. And there will be a difference in the cost of completion to the design stage. So there's all these issues. Or do we allow the developer to choose? It's just quite fundamental issues there. And then what happens if you contract it to a supplier, allowable solution supplier, and they don't actually deliver? Who's going to check that they're actually doing exactly what they promised to do on the tin? And how would that actually work? There's obviously going to be a massive administration cost to do with this, because we've invented this new industry. So how's the certificates, quantifying what the carbon numbers are and everything else like that, and the policing of it. So there's a whole administration cost. And obviously we're going to need to invent this market very quickly, because developers are going out buying land at the moment and they don't want any relative uncertainty getting towards 2016. And if there isn't actually an industry to deliver these allowable solutions, what are we going to do?
Last question.
Yeah, of course.
If you were to choose to do on completion, your tonnage is going to be site-wide.
Yes.
You're not going to do it per dwelling, or are you? You're going to need a...
Yeah, you're right. So the air pressure test results wouldn't be in, so you wouldn't know what
So you might as
completion.
well do it right at the beginning until right at the end when you sell the last unit.
Yeah. And could there be a lag? Can you pay it, after the last
And how
one?
do you comply with building regs if you haven't paid it yet, and it's on a house type, not on a development?
Yes,
So you've got
It's a chicken and egg
yeah,
situation.
you've got a SAP per dwelling, but you've got an overall tonnage per site.
Yeah.
Or probably they'll approach it like they approach SAP right now, design stage SAP as both SAP, and probably they'll have a
But
design
it's not
Yeah,
really
but
what you pay.
when do you pay the money to
design
get the
stage,
certificate?
and then that stays in a contingency place, sort of like if you complete
Developers
it,
won't
it's the
pay
same.
it up front, because you could be paying for 1,500 units, or even if you phase it, you're not going to pay for 100 that you're delivering over 2 years.
Yeah. There's massive issues related to timing and delivery, and also you've got to balance all these carbon solutions in effect to get the carbon price. So who's going to quantify, if you're delivering low energy heat to your neighbours, who's going to actually quantify what that carbon saving is? So the whole ream of work around it, which is equally as complicated.
Surely they just nationalise it and eventually call it what it is, which is a tax.
Who knows? And then also another question came up: should allowable solutions be able? Do you need to stay in England, or can it be in the UK? Can you have the wind farm in Scotland if they go independent? It may be more sensible to have your allowable solutions in Europe if you're going for a solar strategy, etc., etc. So there's a whole ream of. These are just a few. There's considerably more, even more technical questions than that. But you can see the delivery is going to be very different.
Is this sort of process that other EU countries are sort of looking at, or
I don't actually know.
it's just UK?
Yeah, it's just our plan.
Our sort of what happens.
Yeah.
Is this all based on theory rather than performance?
Well, on the theory of the.
I mentioned earlier that it'd be difficult to see how a house actually performs.
Yeah.
But it sounds like, from what you're saying, it's based on theory.
Well, fundamentally, when we do a SAP calculation, the SAP has a theoretical activity within that dwelling, and that's what produces the carbon numbers. So yeah, you're correct. If you don't use your house very much, you're going to over-deliver your carbon saving. But if you've got 16 kids in your house, you're going to under-deliver. So yeah, it's always a theory, but we are set on this road to deliver this supposed zero carbon.
And it's sort of just going back to there were some estimated costs for different dwelling
Yeah.
types. What standard is that based on?
That's based on, if you looked at the bottom of that slide, it gives you a carbon offset to the bottom.
Okay.
Yeah?
Okay, sorry.
Yeah. So, but again, that would change with time as we get further down with the new SAP system.
Is that based on 2030?
That's
Whichever
based
it is.
on the.
2009?
Yeah, I think so. But there's a carbon number at the bottom of that slide. So yeah. So any more questions on that? Beauty. Hopefully you can see. And then another thing which I don't really understand, and Paul probably a better person to speak to, is the government's not very happy with the transitional arrangements. As Ellen explained, when we go to new building regulations, we've got almost a year to get started, so we won't really start doing the SAPs, the next iteration of SAPs, for another year. And the government's really annoyed about that, and it's to do with the way the legislation's laid in Parliament, which I don't really understand. And they are talking about rectifying that. So this would come on in line in 2016, not in 2017 or 2018. So they were quite aggressive about trying to make it work quicker.
But land is purchased on viability based on what you've got at the time, not
Yes.
what you potentially may have in the future.
Yes,
So
and we don't have the tools to know what this is going to be, so it's really difficult. Any more questions? Okay. Right, now I'm going to move on to the second consultation. So that one there, you could just see there was a massive red tape structure being created for a reason, to deliver zero carbon. Now I'm going to talk about the second consultation, which is the Housing Standards Review, which is removing lots of red tape, which is really quite odd. The Housing Standards Review has basically been instigated by the current government to look at all the housing regulations and voluntary codes that have been developed over the last few years that we all have to work through to deliver houses on site. So they were tasked basically reviewing codes, building regulations, and generally everything they could find in a core set of sort of areas. So these are some of the actual standalone voluntary codes that you may be familiar with, that you get involved in. So the big one for us, the Code of Stable Homes, the London Plan sets energy targets, etc., and space targets. Lifetime Homes is really a tough one for delivering houses with cradle to grave design specification. So all of these voluntary standards have come along with time, but the local authorities have picked up on them and insist on them in certain elements of developments. So what they looked at was building regulations, the requirements of the local authorities in terms of planning, what's going on, how can we make this more simple. So we had a cross-sector working group and basically started looking at all the elements which they perceived as making it difficult to get buildings built, get the market improved. So accessibility, space standards, security, water efficiency, energy, internal environmental standards, materials and processes and compliance. So they were just basically tasked with looking at what all these elements are, what's restricting the industry at the moment, and what can we do to make it better. So completely opposite to what I just talked about with allowable solutions. So they came up with two options. The first one was to develop a new national prescribed standards, or fully integrate all these elements of these standards that are relevant into building regulations. So just tidying up the building regulations and absorbing all that information. The ideal solution was deemed to be absorbing all this information into building regulations, so you've got one point of contact, so you've ended up with two processes. You've got the planning process and building regulations process. No other elements of compliance which you have to jump through. But unfortunately they felt that the time scale they want to work to, that would have been too difficult, and again it's the way the legislation is structured with building regulations would have took too long. So they've gone for an interim solution. So kind of and another problem with going into the building regulations is the building regulations tends to be a national standard. So there are elements within these voluntaries, which I'll explain in a minute, which obviously fit to localism. Okay, so that was causing them some concern if they rush into it. So we're going for this a short-term solution of having a nationally prescribed standards. Okay. And within this document, within this consultation, then there was a little note basically saying the Code for Sustainable Homes will be phased out. It wasn't being consulted on, and that's causing a bit of controversy. The BRE are threatening to take legal action against the government and stuff like that. Whether they get anywhere, we don't know. But basically, the Code for Sustainable Homes, as a result of all of this, will be phased out. So there will be no uplift in the code in the short term, and it will disappear. So what this document is trying to do is fundamentally control the local planning authorities. It's to stop the local planning authorities saying they want a percentage of all new dwellings to have lifetime homes, etc. And setting variable targets across different boroughs. So if you build in London, you can get a wheelchair living standard in one borough, which would differ to its neighbouring borough. So it makes it all very complicated. So that's what this document is basically doing, is tying the hands of the local planning authorities, restricting their flexibility. So there's obviously going to be somewhat of a battle between the local planners and the government, as you can imagine. So where national standards want to be applied, these will be applied by the local planners via the planning conditions in the same methodology as we've got at the moment. Okay? But they'll only be able to set those particular national standards. They won't be able to invent their own. But they do. The planners then need to justify their implication. So they need to make sure it's justifiable and it's costed, etc. And it's not going to hinder the development. So it's quite specific about that. So really, it gives the developer a bit of a helping hand here to actually go back to them and say, well, prove why you need to do it. So when we talk about, so it could be a wheelchair provision. So if they have got an issue with poor housing stock in terms of wheelchair provision, then that would obviously be a justifiable strategy to go for. And basically, it's going to tie their hands considerably.
That's difficult to work out because when you're designing houses or whatever block of flats on the site, you really need to know what space standards you need to work for to know how many units you can fit. So if it comes later on as a planning condition, it says this has to be wheelchair accessible flat, you look at it and think, no way can I fit it in.
Well, yeah, but I think
it has to come
you'd
before, can't come after.
Yeah, but you'd have to get into dialogue with the planners and stuff.
It
So
will be in a
another
development.
charge for consultation pre-apps.
Well, of course.
Too.
So the government is basically going to impose this by a national issue a national policy statement to actually impose this on the local authorities. So they shouldn't be able to get out of it. And they are also talking about legislation if they need to, if the local planners try and get out of it. So they are being quite aggressive. So I think this consultation will go through quite quickly, and it should get into legislation. And then to obviously monitor and report back, there are going to be a working group which is going to review all these standards, which I'm just going to run through now, to actually make sure they're continually relevant. But the overall long-term plan is they will be absorbed into building regulations. So if I quickly go through each section, excuse me. So when we talk about accessibility, we've obviously got Part M within the building regs, which has been there for some time, but we've also got these new voluntary standards or local authority standards which appear now and then. Mainly in London we see a lot of lifetime home requirements. Well, these will in effect be outlawed and be replaced by a 3-tier housing standard. So level 1 will be based on Part M, level 2 will be kind of like a lifetime homes, and level 3 will be a wheelchair standard. So there'll be national standards, so we all understand what they are, and they're not going to differ. And again, the local authority can condition a percentage of dwellings to achieve that, level 2, etc., if it's in their local strategy. So at least it'll be more straight up front. Space standards. Space standards, I understand in some EU countries there are actual stipulated space standards, but the government believes that the market's working really well there, so we're not going to have any house standards, so they'll get smaller and smaller, I suspect. So the only way the local planners can influence the space standards is if it comes in conjunction with a lifetime homes or a wheelchair standard. So there will be no requirements there to space standards. Security. So basically, some of you will be familiar with Secure by Design, which is a police-run scheme for improving the security of new dwellings. This will be replaced by 2 standards. Level 1 will be based on the warranty requirement of NHBC, and the second one, level 2, will be Section 2 of Secure by Design, which is basically the physical security of the dwellings. So again, the local authority could indicate they would like to see level 2, etc. One thing I didn't actually say earlier, which I should have done, all these voluntary standards will exist. They're not going to be completely outlawed by the government. So if your client wants to put you into contract to deliver those, then they will still be required. So these things aren't going to completely disappear. So you just need to be aware. That's later, Sue. That's later. Come on. Water efficiency. They reviewed the water efficiency sort of criteria at the moment. So Part G has been in the building regulations for some time. Code for Sustainable Homes is harder to achieve, but they deem that it's worked quite well, and they're going to leave the standard at 125 litres per person per day. The calculation methodology is somewhat abstract to a lot of people. We earn some money at it, so that's good. But they leave at the moment not to change the methodology into the way we do it. But there was a proposal, there may be a lower limit, 110 litres per person today, where there's areas of freshwater scarcity, etc. And again, that will come through from the LA. And there was a proposal where they do see that the calculation methodology is slightly complicated, so you will be able to do it as a fittings-based assessment. Whether that comes through or not, I don't know. Again, this is a really difficult one to police. How can you tell what the flow rates are, really? Energy. Obviously, at the moment, the energy is being dealt with aggressively by Partel, and also, obviously, the Code for Sustainable Homes led the Partel's improvements year by year. So that will just be dealt with as we've been talking about all morning by building regulations. But one interesting element is the development of heat network grids, which we're seeing quite a lot of in London, will be dealt with by the local planning authority. So the planners will have the power to enforce a heat network to be delivered through a development, etc. But in reality, they don't have the power to force you to connect. And also there is some legislation changes that needs to be done to do with this particular act. So going forward, building regulations will ask the question within Partel, is there a local heat network which you can connect to? If there is, you'd have to put a justifiable reason why you're not going to connect. Okay? So it will become a building regulation, the connection, but the actual delivery of it will still come through the local planners. So there's a slight change there. Whereas at the moment in London, if there's a local heat network, the planners would expect you to connect, and it's very difficult to get out of it, if you want to get out of it. I think Paul mentioned this in his opening statement, indoor environmental standards. The Code for Sustainable Homes dealt with a few of these issues. Other bits of the building regulations deal with other bits. But it's quite a complicated field, and it's something which is difficult to quantify, as Ellen was talking about as well. Overheating. We get involved in doing overheating analysis for high-rise residential in London, etc. But the government believes that there isn't really a defined methodology which is robust enough to take this forward into a standard at the moment. We are going to see big problems in London, other urban areas of dwellings overheating where you can't basically stay in them. But they don't believe there is a methodology. The CIBSE do a methodology. We follow the CIBSE methodology. It's quite a laborious task and it's quite complicated. So they don't really want to get involved in that at the moment, and they're sort of pushing it back on the developers to decide if there is a risk and do they need to mitigate it. Daylighting. Daylighting was included within the Code of Sustainable Homes. Now, daylighting is the performance of the internal condition of a dwelling related to its window size. Is it a nice environment? Is it nice and light? You don't have to turn the lights on. Now, there is no intention of that being taken forward in this standard, so that's disappeared altogether. Sunlight, which is basically talking about the interaction between adjacent buildings, etc., and whether a new plot is going to get reasonable sunlight, that will be left as it is at the moment within the planning structure. And then finally, internal air quality and condensation. They deem that Part L and Part F have probably got that covered at the moment. Arguably not, but they will leave that at the moment and review that going forward. So there's not really a lot of change there. They just basically removed some sort of criteria which would have come through from the code. Materials. Within some London boroughs, we get caught with having to achieve certain green guide ratings related to the BRE for a scheme. They will task that as a planning condition. All of that will not be permitted. That's going to be removed totally. I kind of see some of the logic because the BRE Green Guide is a pretty useless tool at the moment. Over the years they've depleted its value by doing silly things. So that's going to disappear completely. So there will be no sort of environmental criteria on materials. But what they have actually said is they are looking at some of the international and European assessment methods for material selection, which is being developed at the moment, and they will be looking to implement them if they deem them appropriate. How that will work, I don't know. And then process and compliance. How is all this going to be policed going forward? So at the moment they're looking at putting the emphasis on building control, which kind of makes sense because you've got the two processes, you've got the planning, and then you've got one process to completion. So they're looking to expand the role. And within the consultation, they're looking at two methodologies. So building control will determine design and build compliance, and then if they are not going to meet the conditions set by the local authority, if they're not going to comply with those conditions, then it gets pushed back to the local authority to do the enforcement. And secondly, the alternative is that if there's no compliance, then or does the building control body actually do the enforcement? So that's the sort of structure they're talking about at the moment. But I hope you can see it does make things a lot simpler for actually delivering housing, hopefully. So really what this policy is proposing to do is take the power away from the local authority once you pass the threshold of the building. So they would be concentrating on their traditional remits of what the property looks like, whether it's appropriate for the site, etc. But once you're over the threshold, all the elements to do with energy, all the elements to do with all those sections within the building regulations which are kind of relevant, which are overlapping, will be in effect stopped. So any questions on all that?
You mentioned short-term implementation and obviously long-term. What are the targets?
Don't know, because the consultation is to be completed, and then whether they would do a second consultation. The allowable solutions is going to have a second consultation. They've already said that, and I think this one will be rushed through. So really, I've only got 2 years left in this Parliament, so we'll probably try and get in before the end of this. End of the Parliament. So this one will go quickly, I suspect, because it's in their agenda, isn't it? But obviously it depends what the local planning authorities do, because this is removing a massive amount of their power. So they may create legal challenges against it. Yeah, because it's obviously restricted now.
It seems sensible that things like energy consumption and not be able to follow that plan.
Yeah, we've unfortunately this is an area of income for us that we've been working on the last sort of 6-7 years. One borough in London will have an energy requirement to save you 10%. The neighbouring one will have a carbon saving of 20%. So it's two different criteria, two different methodologies. It's just nonsense. And they're all trying to do the same thing, but because they keep writing their own individual policy, then it just causes confusion and it slows everything up. Yes.
Has anybody actually been prosecuted along that bias with individual elections?
Probably not the person to ask, but I suspect not. I don't know. Again, it's always really difficult because we do, as I just said, we do a lot of energy calculation, planning reports, and that's to go into planning. So we define the scheme is going to achieve a 10% carbon saving. That goes into planning. The planners never come back to it. We can produce some SAP calculations which probably demonstrate that it has achieved it a little bit more. But as Ellen said earlier, a couple of the London boroughs are expecting devices to be put onto the properties, which are then going to record the energy delivery from renewables, etc., and compare it against the EPC. And they're going to do this analytical work. Well, I can guarantee it won't work because the EPC won't tally with what they expected it to say. So they are looking at actually doing a leasing methodology and whether they do anything about it in terms of arguing yes or no. I don't know.
I find a lot of the smaller clients tend to try to ignore this.
Yes.
And you try and tell them.
Yes.
You say you've got to do this. And at the end of the day, I find that the law just goes through and we think, has it gone through? Has anybody done anything about it?
Yeah.
Does it really matter anymore?
No, it's really difficult. That's why the local authorities like the Code of Sustainable Homes, because the Code of Sustainable Homes took the responsibility away from them. They didn't have to police it because they got the certificate, and as soon as they got the certificate, they were happy. So it's self-policing in effect. So that's why a lot of them did drift towards putting that down as a condition, and it kind of made life easier for them. But yeah, it's very complicated. Anything else? Yeah, but the allowable solutions, the presentation before is definitely going to have a second consultation. So if you're particularly interested, verse to what they're defining here, I would suggest you get involved because it is going to have to become in some format in the end. So please look out for it. And again, the Zero Carbon Hub is a very good source of information because they're doing a lot of the background work and there's quite a lot of data in their booklets, etc. So talking about the costs and everything else.
Going back on your point about district heating or local heating or energy sources, are we heading towards another problem where people aren't actually in control of their energy costs and energy use anymore? The same as like we're being ripped off by all the energy companies. There is I think it's a bit of an odd agenda in London. So there's a thing called the London Heat Map, which is sponsored by the GLA. So if you go on the London Heat Map, you can pull up a credit map of London and you can see where proposals and actual heat mains are being installed. And how they're going to police the cost of those, because it isn't, you're signing up for a monopoly. Once you signed up to that apparatus, you're stuck with that company. I've just got a job at the moment, which we're working through in Ealing, and they are developing a massive heat network there. And the planners have even put a statement in one of their documentation saying that the heat supply will be subsidised against the national average gas bill. So it's all nonsense. So they already realise it's going to be inefficient, and they already realise they've got a price issue, and they're going to subsidise it. So they're going to cross-pollinate, and it's just it's a strange agenda. Is it going to be what we maintain?
Yeah.
In the 50s or 40s, they did Pimlico.
Yes.
And that's all been dug up now.
Yes.
Been looked after.
Yeah.
In the 60s, I worked on in Nottingham where they did large areas of St Andrews and Victoria Centre with 16-inch mains coming into the site. And I'm thinking, well, that's a hell of a big thing to look after.
Yeah, they're setting up ESCOs and everybody else to look after it. Yeah, it's a strange agenda at the moment. I'm not quite sure. But what the argument for it
The key argument for it is future-proofing. So what the logic is that when there's a new technology comes in place, when the gas from Russia stops, we can bolt in a new piece of apparatus that's going to deliver all this heat for this heat rate, so everybody doesn't need to have new pieces of kit installed into each dwelling. That's the logic, but getting to that logic it's going to take us a number of years, and it's going to be quite expensive and quite inefficient to get.
I was in Berlin last week, and one of the largest housing providers, a housing association, stripping out all their district heating systems, mainly for maintenance, but also they've got to have them on 24/7.
Yeah,
They have to have that demand. So they're now stripping those out and putting individual boilers into. So we're a bit behind.
The problem we've got, the fundamental flaw we've got in the whole system is gas boilers are bloody efficient. 90% efficient, they do, they work really well. They're instant, you've got control over them, and whatever you say about the news in the last few months, heating's still pretty cheap, really. If you work it out, it is pretty cheap. I know it's going to go up, and everything else like that. So gas is a cheap fuel, and it's a carbon efficient fuel. So it's really difficult to argue against it. The big agenda which we should be doing, we shouldn't be doing any of this. This is all nonsense. We should be decarbonising the national grid. If we decarbonise the national grid as quickly as we could, we'd all just have electric heating at home and we'd all be done. So we wouldn't be talking about district heating, etc. So that would be the sensible approach. But for some reason, the house builders, the developers are being penalised to deliver something which is not really their remit, really, I'd argue, to a point.
It's a bit too much, Sandy, so I've got a bit.
I've gone off on one of that.
Utopian for
Okay. Any more questions?
New Energy Minister then.
Oh, am I? All right.
Right, any other questions at all, generally, for Andy or Ellen or nothing at all? Well, thanks for coming along. Hope you've gained something from it. Probably more confusion than anything else until the next lot of consultations come out and the implementation in the next few months. So we'll all be waiting with bated breath for the approved documents and the new software, and as everything, the government and the suppliers are all on top of it, as you can tell. But hopefully we'll be able to provide you with information over the coming months. As Ellen said, we'll be putting stuff on our website, we'll be sending stuff through to you, keep you up to date with exactly how things are going and how that applies to you. And as ever, we've got our assessors and our building control surveyors who will give you advice if you've got anything particular on upcoming developments over the coming months. Thanks very much for attending. Have a safe drive to wherever you're going next, and hopefully see you again at our next seminar, which will probably be fairly soon, I say. Okay, thank you very much.